Millionaire pretends to be blind to test an 8-year-old beggar girl. But what she did left everyone in shock. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment and join us on this emotional journey. Let us get started. Charles Hawkins sat in his grandiose but empty mansion, staring out the window at the dull gray sky. The silence was deafening. The sound of his own breathing echoed through the massive, cold walls. It was a silence that had crept into every part of his life, a reminder of all he had lost. The mansion, which once echoed with laughter and life, now seemed more like a tomb. The walls felt as if they were closing in on him. He ran his fingers over the smooth wood of the table, the faint shine reflecting the soft, sad light that filtered through the heavy curtains. His gaze shifted to the old photographs on the mantelpiece, black and white images of a life he once knew. A happy family, a beautiful wife, children with smiles that could light up the darkest of rooms. But that was years ago. Everything had changed. Charles was no longer the successful businessman he once was. He was no longer the proud father who had once stood tall beside his wife. The years had eaten away at him, leaving only the hollow shell of a man who couldn't remember how to be happy. His wife, Elizabeth, had passed away 5 years ago. And his children? They were long gone, living their own lives far away. He hadn't spoken to them in over a year. Charles had thrown himself into his business for so long, believing wealth and power would fill the emptiness he felt. But now he realized it had only made the void grow larger. Sitting alone in his mansion, the weight of his choices hung heavy. He wondered, not for the first time, if it was too late to change. Could he make amends? Was there any way to repair the pieces of his broken heart? The sound of a faint knock at the door startled him. He hadn't been expecting anyone. The butler had been dismissed months ago, and only a handful of people even knew he existed anymore. Charles slowly rose to his feet, wiping away a tear that had unknowingly escaped his eyes. He opened the door to find a little girl. She was tiny, no older than 8, with a ragged dress that barely covered her legs. Her hair, tangled and matted, framed a face so thin it seemed impossible to imagine she could be alive. Her brown eyes, wide and filled with a quiet desperation, met his. "Please, sir," she whispered, "could you spare some change? I'm hungry." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. The desperation in her voice, the innocence in her eyes, it was as if everything inside him was pulled to the surface. His heart ached in a way it hadn't for years. But Charles didn't react immediately. He stood there for a long moment, studying her. The world outside, the mansion around him, everything faded. He didn't know why, but something about this little girl, this stranger, felt different. As she stood there waiting, Charles made a decision. A strange one. He wasn't sure why, but he felt compelled to act. "Come in," he said softly. The words were almost a whisper. The girl hesitated for a moment, before stepping over the threshold into the vast mansion. "I am Charles," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "What's your name?" The girl looked up at him, still unsure, but the hunger in her eyes spoke volumes. "Angela," she replied softly. Angela looked around the lavishly decorated foyer, her small hands clutching the edges of her dress. She had never been inside a mansion before, never seen anything so extravagant. Yet, as she looked at the darkened corners of the grand house, she felt a strange sense of unease. It didn't feel warm, not like a home. It felt cold and distant, like the rest of the world had forgotten about it. "I don't have much," Charles said, motioning for her to sit on a chair. He gestured to a tray of food on the table, but Angela hesitated. "I don't need that," she murmured. "I am not here for food. I wanted to ask if you could help me. I don't have anywhere else to go." Charles watched her, the words lingering in the air. There was something about the way Angela said it that hit him harder than he expected. He had been in her shoes once, years ago, before he had built this empire of wealth. He remembered the hunger, the uncertainty, the fear of not knowing where he would sleep the next night, but now he had everything, and nothing at all. He motioned to the food. "Please, Angela, eat. I don't know how to help you, but I can at least give you something to eat. I think. We both could use it." Angela blinked, her eyes searching his face for sincerity. After a long moment, she sat down and hesitantly took a bite. As the minutes ticked by, Charles began to feel something shift inside him. Angela wasn't just a child on the street. She was more than that. She was a reminder of everything he had lost and everything he had never truly understood about himself. In a way, she was a mirror, reflecting the things he had buried deep inside, things he didn't want to face. But as he watched her eat, he felt a sense of purpose spark within him, something he hadn't felt in years. A part of him wanted to protect her, to shield her from the world that had already taken so much from her. And another part wanted to test her. Charles had always been the master of control. He had built his wealth by seeing people for what they truly were, calculating, opportunistic, selfish. But Angela, she was different. She wasn't like the others he had known. A thought crossed his mind. What if he could test her? What if he could see if her innocence was truly as pure as it appeared? Maybe, just maybe, she would be the key to saving him from his own emptiness. As Angela finished her meal, Charles cleared his throat, his mind already turning over his next words. "Angela," he began, his voice tinged with an unexpected gentleness, "I need to ask you something." The little girl looked up at him, her eyes wide and trusting. I need you to do something for me. It is not easy, but I think it could help both of us." Angela's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" Charles paused, his heart raced, but he knew he had to follow through. He couldn't let this chance slip away. "I want you to test me. Pretend I am a beggar like you. See how I react. See if I am kind or if I'll turn away." Angela stared at him, unsure of what he meant, but Charles could see the flicker of curiosity in her eyes. For a moment, he wondered if this test was for her or for him. The chapter ends with Angela nodding, a faint look of confusion on her face. Charles watches her as she prepares to test him, uncertain about what will unfold. One thing is clear: this strange encounter will change everything for both of them. But how? Only time will tell. Angela hesitated. The strange request that Charles had made of her hung in the air, heavy with mystery. She didn't fully understand what he was asking, but something in his voice told her this wasn't just a simple favor. She looked at him for a long moment, trying to read the man who sat across from her, his face tired but still somehow commanding. Charles Hawkins. This man who seemed to have everything was asking her to pretend to be someone else, someone lesser, someone without a voice. "Pretend?" she whispered, almost as if testing the words herself. "Pretend to be what?" Charles leaned forward, his eyes intense but gentle. He lowered his voice to a near whisper, as if sharing a secret. "Pretend to be like you were when you came to me today. Hungry, desperate, needing something. I want you to test me, Angela. See if I'll help. See if I'll turn you away, just like the world does. I need to know if I can trust myself." Angela frowned, trying to grasp the full meaning behind his words. She had been hungry. Yes, more than she could remember. She had wandered the streets without a place to rest, without anyone to turn to. It was just the way life had been for as long as she could remember. But what did this man mean by testing? And why her? Why me? She asked quietly. Why not someone else? I am just a kid. What difference does it make if I do this? Charles paused, looking at her with a strange mix of admiration and pity. Because you remind me of something I lost. You remind me of the innocence I no longer have. His words were softer now, as though speaking to himself more than to her. I've seen so much. My life, Angela. I've done so many things I regret. And I need to know if you, someone who has nothing, can find it in yourself to trust me. Maybe I can find something in myself too. Maybe I can change. Angela's gaze softened, a flicker of understanding crossing her face. Despite her confusion, she nodded. There was something about Charles Hawkins that made her want to help him, even if she didn't fully understand why. Perhaps it was his vulnerability, or maybe it was just the desperation in his voice. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like the beggar. She felt like she was being given a choice. "I'll do it," she said quietly. "But I don't know how I am supposed to do it. You want me to pretend, but I am not pretending. I am hungry. I am desperate." Charles gave her a small, sad smile. "I understand. Just come back tomorrow. We'll do this then." The next day, as the sun barely started to peek over the horizon, Angela returned to the mansion. She had spent the night in a nearby alley, wrapped in layers of tattered cloth that did little to protect her from the cold. Her stomach growled with hunger, and her body ached from the hard ground beneath her. But she didn't mind. She had grown used to it. When she arrived at the mansion, Charles was already waiting for her by the door. He didn't speak at first, just watched her for a moment. She saw his eyes narrow, as if studying her. "Are you ready?" he finally asked. Angela nodded. She didn't really know what she was supposed to do, but she understood what he meant. She was supposed to be that girl again, the one who had no home, no family, no one to care for her. She was supposed to show him what the world was really like. Without another word, she walked up the stairs and knocked at the large wooden door. The door opened, and Charles was standing there, dressed in his expensive suit, as if nothing had changed. His expression was unreadable, though a flicker of something guilt crossed his face when he saw her. Angela hesitated for a moment, her heart racing, but then she stepped forward, as if the weight of the world was on her tiny shoulders. She looked up at him, her face thin, eyes wide and desperate. "Please, sir," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. I am hungry. Could you spare some change, just enough to get some food? Please." Charles didn't react immediately. He simply stood there, looking at her, almost as if he were waiting for something. Angela repeated the words, feeling more and more small under his gaze. She knew how this went, how people like him looked at people like her. Disgust, indifference, sometimes pity. But then something unexpected happened. Charles looked away, a strange, conflicted expression crossing his face. For a moment, Angela thought he might turn her away, just like everyone else. But instead, he stepped back and motioned for her to come inside. "I'll give you something to eat," he said, his voice low and tinged with something Angela couldn't quite place. He seemed different, as if the test wasn't just for her, but for him too. Angela entered the mansion, following him down the long, ornate hallways. The house felt colder now, emptier. As she passed by the grand rooms, she saw the photographs of his family, the ones she had noticed the day before. The smiles of people who were no longer there. It made her stomach twist with a strange feeling, something akin to sympathy. They entered a dining room and Charles motioned for her to sit at the long table. A tray of food was already set out: warm bread, fruit, and a small portion of soup. Angela hesitated, still unsure of what was going on. Was this some sort of game to him? Did he see her as nothing more than a test? But the hunger inside her made the decision for her. She sat down and took a small bite, savoring the warmth and the taste. She hadn't had a meal like this in so long. Charles watched her as she ate, his face a mixture of emotions. The girl before him, Angela, was not what he expected. She was more than just a test. She was a reflection of everything he had buried in his own life. He had thought he could test her, make her into something he could control, but instead, she was the one who was testing him. He had expected to feel powerful, but all he felt now was small. As Angela finished the meal, Charles looked at her, a new understanding beginning to form. "You're not like the others," he said, almost to himself. "I expected you to be just like the world, just like the people who pass you by without a second glance. But you were not. You were stronger than that." Angela looked up, confused. "I am not strong. I am just hungry." Charles smiled faintly. "Maybe that's the strength I need to see." As Angela left the mansion that day, her mind was spinning. What had just happened? Was Charles different from the people she had known? Was he really trying to change? And why had he chosen her for this strange test? But even more pressing was the question that lingered in the back of her mind. What did he expect from her next? The chapter ended with a sense of unease hanging in the air. The test had begun, but neither Charles nor Angela understood the depth of what it would reveal about them both. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the mansion's sprawling grounds. Angela's footsteps echoed softly in the vast hallways as she made her way to the door. The house, which had felt like an intimidating fortress just days ago, now seemed to hold a strange, quiet weight. Charles had asked her to come back again, but this time something was different. Angela didn't know what he wanted from her. The previous day had been strange, even surreal. He had shown her kindness, yes, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being tested, used, perhaps as part of some grand experiment that was beyond her understanding. She had come to the mansion out of sheer desperation, but now it was something else. Her curiosity gnawed at her. What was it that made this man so interested in her? A poor, hungry girl with nothing but her wits to rely on. What was it that had prompted him to show her this unexpected generosity? Before she could answer her own questions, the door opened and there he was, Charles Hawkins, standing tall in the doorway, his expression unreadable, as if he'd been expecting her all along. "Angela," he said, his voice steady but distant, "I need you to do something for me." She stood at the entrance for a moment, unsure of what to say. She had no reason to trust him, no reason to believe that any of this was more than a game. And yet something deep inside her made her want to stay, made her want to prove that there was more to her than the world had ever seen. "Yes," she said, her voice small but filled with tentative curiosity. Charles motioned for her to step inside, closing the door behind her with a soft click. He led her into the study, his study. The air was thick with the smell of old books, polished wood, and a faint scent of cologne that seemed to linger in every corner. "I want you to do something for me, Angela," he began, his tone now a little more serious, even colder. "I need you to pretend to be someone you're not. Pretend to be someone you've never been, someone who is above the life you've known." Angela raised an eyebrow. "Above?" she repeated, incredulity creeping into her voice. "What does that mean?" Charles paused, as if considering his words carefully. "I need you to see how the world sees me. I want to know if, in my world, someone like you, someone who has nothing, would even be noticed. I want to know if the world will see you, or if they will simply look past you, as they do to everyone else." Angela felt the weight of his words pressing down on her chest, tightening with every passing second. He wasn't just testing her. He was asking her to play a role she hadn't asked for, to become something she wasn't, to fit into a life she could never imagine. "Why me?" she asked again, her voice tinged with frustration. "Why would you want to test the world through me? What do you get out of it?" Charles looked at her for a long time, as if debating whether to tell her the truth. "Because I've spent my life playing a role," he said quietly, "and I'm beginning to wonder if it is even worth it, if it is all real. I need to know if someone like you can do what I can, if you can navigate this world with your honesty, your simplicity, if you can survive the same way I have, but without the masks." Angela stared at him, struggling to make sense of what he was saying. She knew nothing about the world he lived in, but something in his voice told her that he was desperate for the answers he was asking her to find. Perhaps she was just a means to an end, but in that moment, she also understood that this was his way of confronting his own demons, of testing whether it was possible to live authentically in a world that thrived on deception. She sighed, rubbing her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of the world pressing down on her fragile shoulders. "I'll do it," she said finally, her voice firm despite the uncertainty swirling inside her. "But on one condition." Charles raised an eyebrow. "What is that?" "You don't treat me like a charity case. You don't look down on me just because you have money and power. If I'm going to do this, I need to know you are not going to play games with me. No more pretending. I want this to be real." For the first time since Angela had met him, Charles Hard exterior cracked, if only for a second. He looked at her with something akin to respect, maybe even admiration. "I can promise you that," he said. "This one to be a game." And so, the test began. Angela found herself stepping into a role she never imagined for herself, a role that forced her to confront not just the world outside, but the world within her as well. Charles had asked her to pretend to be someone above her means, someone who had it all: wealth, power, status. He wanted to see if the world would treat her differently, and Angela? She wanted to see if the world would finally see her for who she truly was, or if it would just cast her aside, as it always had. She wasn't as sure what would happen, but she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't turn back now. The night was colder than Angela had expected. The fire in the grand fireplace crackled softly, casting long shadows across the room. Charles had retreated to his study after dinner, leaving Angela to linger in the large drawing room, surrounded by portraits of people long forgotten, their eyes eternally fixed on her. It was the silence that unnerved her most, the eerie stillness that filled the massive space. She was an interloper in this world of wealth and privilege, a visitor who didn't belong. But tonight, something felt different. As she sat on the velvet armchair by the fire, her thoughts wandered. What was Charles really asking of her? How could she, a girl who had spent her entire life just surviving, be part of this game? Part of a world that felt like a strange, glittering prison? Her gaze shifted to the window, the dark sky speckled with stars. She could almost feel the world outside calling to her, a world where people fought for every scrap, where hope was fleeting, but still somehow alive. The sound of footsteps interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find Charles entering the room, his posture stiff, his face as unreadable as ever. He was dressed in a deep black suit, the kind of suit that seemed to have been tailored for someone else, a man of power, wealth, and influence. A man who had everything except peace. "Mind if I join you?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a subtle crack in his polished exterior. "Not at all," Angela replied, though her heart skipped a beat. She had gotten so used to him, being distant and aloof, that the warmth in his tone caught her off guard. It was like he was human for once. He took a seat across from her, in a chair that matched hers but was slightly more ornate, as if he were the ruler of the space, even if only symbolically. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he stared into the fire, his eyes distant. For a moment, neither of them said a word. The crackling of the logs in the fire filled the silence, but it felt heavier than the sound of flames. "Do you ever wonder why we do this?" he asked, his voice low and thoughtful, almost to himself. Angela raised an eyebrow, unsure what he meant. "Do what?" "Live like this," he replied, his gaze still fixed on the fire. "In this cage of wealth and expectations. Do you ever wonder if it's all worth it?" The question caught Angela off guard. She wasn't used to hearing him speak this way, vulnerable, uncertain. This was the man who had controlled every conversation, every encounter. This was the man who had tested her like a puppet in his little game. "I think you're the one who has everything," Angela said carefully, not sure if she should be speaking so candidly. "I am the one who's just trying to survive." Charles finally turned his gaze toward her, his expression unreadable. "You are wrong," he said quietly. "I don't have everything. I have things, money, status, control, but I don't have peace. I don't have what you have." Angela frowned. "What do you mean?" He exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck as if the weight of his words was heavier than he'd anticipated. You still have hope, Angela. Despite everything, despite the world you come from, you haven't given up, and I envy that. Angela didn't know how to respond. She had never thought of herself as someone others could envy, especially not someone like Charles, who seemed to have it all. You don't look down on me just because you have money and power. If I'm going to do this, I need to know you're not going to play games with me. No more pretending. I want this to be real. For the first time since Angela had met him, Charles' hard exterior cracked, if only for a second. He looked at her with something akin to respect, maybe even admiration. I can promise you that, he said. this one to be a game. And so, the test began. Angela found herself stepping into a role she never imagined for herself, a role that forced her to confront not just the world outside, but the world within her as well. Charles had asked her to pretend to be someone above her means, someone who had it all: wealth, power, status. He wanted to see if the world would treat her differently. And Angela? She wanted to see if the world would finally see her for who she truly was, or if it would just cast her aside, as it always had. She wasn't sure what would happen, but she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't have turned back now. The night was colder than Angela had expected. The fire in the grand fireplace crackled softly, casting long shadows across the room. Charles had retreated to his study after dinner, leaving Angela to linger in the large drawing room, surrounded by portraits of people long forgotten, their eyes eternally fixed on her. It was the silence that unnerved her most, the eerie stillness that filled the massive space. She was an interloper in this world of wealth and privilege, a visitor who didn't belong. But tonight, something felt different. As she sat on the velvet armchair by the fire, her thoughts wandered. What was Charles really asking of her? How could she, a girl who had spent her entire life just surviving, be part of this game? Part of a world that felt like a strange, glittering prison? Her gaze shifted to the window, the dark sky speckled with stars. She could almost feel the world outside calling to her. A world where people fought for every scrap, where hope was fleeting but still somehow alive. The sound of footsteps interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find Charles entering the room, his posture stiff, his face as unreadable as ever. He was dressed in a deep black suit, the kind of suit that seemed to have been tailored for someone else, a man of power, wealth, and influence. A man who had everything except peace. "Mind if I join you?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a subtle crack in his polished exterior. "Not at all," Angela replied, though her heart skipped a beat. She had gotten so used to him, being distant and aloof, that the warmth in his tone caught her off guard. It was like he was human for once. He took a seat across from her, in a chair that matched hers but was slightly more ornate, as if he were the ruler of the space, even if only symbolically. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he stared into the fire, his eyes distant. For a moment, neither of them said a word. The crackling of the logs in the fire filled the silence, but it felt heavier than the sound of flames. "Do you ever wonder why we do this?" he asked, his voice low and thoughtful, almost to himself. Angela raised an eyebrow, unsure what he meant. "Do what?" "Live like this," he replied, his gaze still fixed on the fire. "In this cage of wealth and expectations. Do you ever wonder if it's all worth it?" The question caught Angela off guard. She wasn't used to hearing him speak this way, vulnerable, uncertain. This was the man who had controlled every conversation, every encounter. This was the man who had tested her like a puppet in his little game. "I think you were the one who has everything," Angela said carefully, not sure if she should be speaking so candidly. "I am the one who's just trying to survive." Charles finally turned his gaze toward her, his expression unreadable. "You are wrong," he said quietly. "I don't have everything. I have things: money, status, control, but I don't have peace. I don't have what you have." Angela frowned. "What do you mean?" He exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck as if the weight of his words was heavier than he'd anticipated. You still have hope, Angela. Despite everything, despite the world you come from, you haven't given up, and I envy that." Angela didn't know how to respond. She had never thought of herself as someone others could envy, especially not someone like Charles, who seemed to have it all. She had to remember that. She couldn't let her emotions get tangled up in the game. But then, just as quickly, another thought surfaced. What if she didn't want to play the game anymore? She opened her eyes, staring at her reflection in the glass. She didn't recognize the girl who stared back at her. She was no longer the scrappy, street-smart girl from the slums. She wasn't even the same person who had entered Charles' world only a few weeks ago. She had changed. Was that a good thing? Angela sighed, running her hands through her tangled hair. It was easier to just keep pushing forward, to keep pretending like everything was under control. Easier than confronting the feelings that were, slowly, insidiously, creeping up on her. She stood abruptly, crossing the room and grabbing her coat. She needed to clear her head. The estate felt suffocating sometimes, like a gilded cage that she couldn't quite escape, no matter how hard she tried. As she stepped out into the cool night air, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The garden outside was quiet, the only sound the rustle of leaves in the wind. The moonlight bathed everything in a soft glow, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch into infinity. And there, in the distance, she saw him. Charles. He was standing by the garden fountain, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his back to her. For a moment, Angela considered turning around, heading back inside. She didn't want to deal with him tonight, not when she was so conflicted, so uncertain of what she felt. But something drew her forward, as if some invisible force was pulling her to him. "Charles?" she called softly, her voice cutting through the quiet night. He turned slowly, as if he had known she was there all along. His face, usually so composed, was unreadable. "Candace sleep?" he asked, his tone casual, though there was something almost guarded in it. Angela shook her head, stepping closer. "No, just needed some air." For a moment they stood in silence, the tension thick between them. Neither of them seemed to know what to say next. Finally, Charles spoke. "You've been different lately," he said, his voice quieter now. "I can see it, and I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing." Angela's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" He looked at her, his eyes dark and intense, as if he were trying to decipher some mystery hidden deep within her. "You've stopped trying to play the game. You've stopped pretending. You were letting yourself feel something, and that's dangerous." Angela felt a chill creep down her spine. She had never expected him to be so perceptive, but his words struck a echoing her own thoughts back to her. She had stopped playing the game. She had stopped pretending to be the girl she was supposed to be. "I'm not sure I want to play anymore," she admitted, her voice soft, almost fragile. Charles's gaze softened, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, something dark, something he wasn't ready to share. "You can't escape the game, Angela," he said, his voice low. "Not now. Not when you've already come this far." Angela felt her pulse quicken. She knew he was right. There was no going back now. She had crossed a line, and there was no undoing the choices she had made. But as she looked at Charles, really looked at him, she realized that she wasn't the only one trapped. He too was caught in a web of his own making, tangled up in his own fears, his own regrets. And in that moment, Angela realized that neither of them could escape. At least, not without facing the truth. The weeks that followed were like a slow burn, each passing day feeling heavier than the last. Angela had settled into a strange rhythm with Charles, their interactions more frequent but always guarded. It was clear that he was still testing her, still keeping her at arm's length. Yet as much as she wanted to pull away, to guard her own heart, she found herself pulled deeper into the world he had built, this world that she didn't fully understand, but that seemed to offer something she had always craved: security. Still, there was an undeniable tension between them, something unspoken but tangible, like an invisible thread that connected them, even though both tried to keep their distance. But then came that night. It was a quiet evening, the kind that was all too familiar at the estate, where everything seemed perfectly curated, perfectly in place. Angela had spent the afternoon wandering the grand halls, feeling more and more like an outsider in a world that didn't belong to her. As she walked through the lavish hallway, passing portraits of long-dead ancestors and expensive vases she was too afraid to touch, something caught her eye. A door slightly ajar. She had never noticed it before. Her curiosity got the better of her, and without thinking, she pushed the door open, revealing a room filled with dust and shadows. The room was small, tucked away in the corner of the estate, and it looked as though it hadn't been touched in years. But there, in the middle of the room, was a table covered in papers, and on the table one singular photograph. She walked toward it, her heart pounding in her chest. The photo was old, faded with age. In it, Charles was standing next to a woman, his mother, perhaps. Both of them were smiling, though there was an air of sadness that lingered around them, something that spoke of memories too painful to forget. Angela reached out to touch the photograph, but before her fingers could graze its surface, she heard a voice behind her. "You shouldn't be here," she froze, her hand mid-air. Slowly, she turned around, her breath catching in her throat as she came face to face with Charles. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something raw, something unspoken. He wasn't angry, but there was a weight in his gaze, a heaviness that made Angela feel as though she had stumbled into something she wasn't meant to see. "I didn't mean to," she said softly, taking a step back. I didn't know about this room." Charles didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped into the room, his eyes locking on the photograph that Angela had been studying. There was a long silence, the air thick with tension before he finally spoke. "That was taken before everything changed," he said, his voice quieter now. "Before I became who I am." Angela could see the way his eyes lingered on the picture, the way his jaw tightened as if he were holding back a storm. She wanted to ask more, to understand what had happened, but she didn't. She couldn't bring herself to pry any further. "Charles, what happened?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, it felt as though he were standing on the edge of something painful, something that had been buried for far too long. But then, just as quickly, the moment passed. Charles's expression hardened and he took a step back, distancing himself from the vulnerability that had almost surfaced. "You're not supposed to know that," he said, his voice colder now. "Not yet." Angela watched him carefully, her heart heavy with the knowledge that there were pieces of him, pieces that he had locked away, pieces that he wasn't ready to share. She could see the pain behind his walls, but he wasn't willing to let anyone in, not even her. She took a deep breath, feeling a strange mix of sympathy and frustration. She had thought that maybe, just maybe, she could help him. But she was wrong. Charles was as closed off as ever, trapped in a past he was unwilling to confront. He turned away, his back to her now. "This room, this part of my life, it's off limits. Understand?" Angela nodded slowly, her heart sinking. "I understand." As Charles left the room, Angela remained standing there, staring at the photograph. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was so much more to his story, so much more that he wasn't telling her. The weight of his past, the secrets he carried, were like a dark cloud hanging over them both. But she also realized something else. She was beginning to understand him more than he realized, and the more she understood, the more complicated things became. Because now Angela wasn't just trying to survive. She wasn't just trying to prove herself. She was starting to care. And that scared her. Angela couldn't sleep that night. The image of the photograph, the way it had seemed to speak volumes about Charles, about his past, kept replaying in her mind. She had always known that there was more to him than met the eye. But this was different. There was a deep sorrow behind his cold demeanor, a pain he tried so hard to bury. It was as if the entire estate held secrets, memories locked away in its walls. And Charles was just a fragment of a much larger story. For the first time since arriving, Angela felt something shift inside her. It was no longer just about proving herself or surviving in this world of privilege. She found herself caring for someone she never expected to. She had always kept her distance from people, from relationships, ever since she'd learned that trusting others often led to pain. But Charles wasn't like the others. He wasn't the street toughs or the greedy businessmen she'd met in her life. He was different. She wasn't sure how yet, but she was starting to see him in a new light. She couldn't explain it, but she felt a responsibility toward him, a need to understand his pain, to help him carry the weight of it. But that wasn't her place. She was just a test, an experiment, wasn't she? Charles had made it clear he had no intention of letting her into the parts of him that hurt. But Angela wasn't so easily deterred. The next morning, Angela found herself in the large dining hall, sitting at one of the long tables, when she saw Charles enter. His usual sharp suit and impassive face were in place, but this time, something in his eyes caught her attention. Something flickered behind them, something soft. For the first time, she saw a chink in his armor. Without thinking, she stood up and walked toward him. I know you're carrying something," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, but it was enough to break the silence between them. Charles paused, looking at her as if she had said something unthinkable. His expression tightened, but she noticed his hand, the one that had been resting on the back of the chair, was shaking. He quickly covered it with his other hand. "I don't know what you mean," he replied stiffly, but Angela could hear the hesitation in his voice. "Yes, you do," she said, her words carrying the weight of her own hidden vulnerabilities. "You're trying so hard to push it all away. But you don't have to." For a moment, Charles just stared at her, and Angela felt a sudden surge of fear. She had crossed a line. But before she could backtrack, before she could retreat into the safety of silence, Charles sighed deeply and slumped into a chair at the table. "Sit down," he said, his voice low and tired. Angela hesitated but then obeyed, taking a seat across from him. The silence stretched between them, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was understanding. "Why did you come here, Angela?" Charles asked, his gaze now softer than it had ever been. It was as if he was seeing her for the first time. Angela blinked, caught off guard by the question. She had asked herself that same thing countless times, but now, in this moment, the answer seemed clearer than ever. She hadn't come here to play games. She hadn't come here to survive, to prove a point. No, she had come because she was searching for something that she had never had before, something more than the cold streets and the hollow promises of survival. "I came here because I thought I had to," she said slowly, "because I needed to. But now..." She paused, not knowing how to finish the thought. Her eyes met his, and for a fleeting second they both understood. Now, she realized, it wasn't just about testing herself. It wasn't just about surviving in his world. She had come here because she had felt something in him, something she couldn't ignore. She had seen his pain, and it had drawn her in just as his presence seemed to draw her in. Charles leaned back in his chair, staring out the window. The soft morning light cast shadows across his face, making him appear older, more burdened. "People don't change, Angela," he said after a long pause. "Not really. They might put on a new face, a new mask, but inside they were still the same. I'm still the same. You don't understand what I've been through, the choices I've made." Angela shook her head. "I don't have to understand everything to know that you're not the man you think you are. You're not some monster, Charles. You are just a man who's been hurt, like everyone else. But that doesn't mean it is too late." Charles let out a bitter laugh, though it lacked the humor. "You think I can just change just like that?" he asked, his eyes flashing. "You think that someone like me can just decide to be different? To stop being this?" "I do," Angela said, her voice unwavering. "I believe people can change, and I believe you can too." For a moment, Charles looked at her as though he had never seen her before. And perhaps, for the first time, he was starting to see her as something more than just a test, more than just the poor girl who had nothing to lose. Perhaps he was beginning to see her as someone who was real, someone who cared. And in that moment, Angela realized something else. Charles had been testing her, but now she was testing him. She wasn't just trying to survive anymore. She was trying to reach him, to break through his walls, to show him that there was more to life than the game he had been playing all these years. Maybe, just maybe, she could help him see that. The days that followed that pivotal conversation were different. Charles had been distant, as though he had retreated further into his fortress of silence. But there was a subtle shift in his demeanor, something almost imperceptible, but present. Angela couldn't quite place it, but it made her believe, for the first time, that her words had struck a chord with him. He wasn't as cold, not entirely, and that small change gave her hope, but the game had not stopped. Charles still expected her to play the role of the impoverished, vulnerable test subject. He had not yet shown his true hand, not fully. The expectations were clear. She was here to prove something. But what exactly? Angela couldn't stay in this strange limbo forever. She couldn't keep walking the line between survival and something more. Something was pulling her deeper into this world, and she could no longer deny that a part of her wanted more. She didn't just want to survive anymore. She wanted to understand him, to know him, maybe even to help him. But how could she when he kept pushing her away? It was a strange thing, Angela realized. She wasn't just testing Charles, she was testing herself. One afternoon, a few days after their last conversation, Charles called her into his study. Angela hesitated for only a moment before walking toward the familiar, dark wooden doors. His study was where he made decisions, big ones, the kind that shaped lives. It was the nerve center of his empire, and Angela had always kept her distance, never stepping inside unless summoned. As she walked in, she saw Charles seated at his desk, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked tired, older somehow. His suit was rumpled, his hair disheveled, details Angela had never noticed before but now seemed important. "Close the door," he said, his voice rough. Angela obeyed, the soft click of the door seeming louder in the otherwise quiet room. He didn't look up at her immediately. His attention focused on the papers spread out before him. Angela stood in silence, unsure of what to say. The air felt thick with tension, as though something big was about to happen. Finally, Charles set the glass down and turned his chair to face her. His gaze was heavy, almost unreadable. "I've been thinking." Angela swallowed hard. "About what?" "About you," he said, and the way he said it made Angela's heart skip a beat. "And about this whole situation, this test." She clenched her fists at her sides, trying to remain calm. She didn't know what he was going to say, but she had an overwhelming feeling that the ground was shifting beneath her. "Listen, Angela," Charles continued, his tone more measured now. "I've spent my life building an empire, testing people, watching them fail, and then discarding them. But you're different. You didn't just play along. You challenged me. You forced me to confront things I've spent years avoiding." Angela's mind raced. What was he getting at? "I didn't want to admit it," he went on, looking down at the glass of whiskey, his fingers tracing its rim. "But there's something about you, something I haven't felt in a long time. Maybe ever." He met her eyes then, and there was a flicker of vulnerability there, a crack in the mask he wore. Angela's breath caught. "What are you saying, Charles?" "I'm saying that Ivy made a decision." He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor as he paced toward the window. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow on his face, highlighting the lines etched in his skin. He wasn't just a millionaire anymore. He was a man haunted by something far older than money. "I want you to stay," he said, his voice low but steady. "I want you to stay, and I want you to prove me wrong." Angela blinked, taken aback. "Prove you wrong?" "Yeah," he said, turning back to face her. "You told me that people could change, that I could change. I've spent my entire life surrounded by people who either want something from me or just want to be around me because of what I can give them. But you were different. I don't know why, but I want to believe you." Angela felt her heart race. This was the moment she had been waiting for. This was the moment where everything could change, for both of them. She could either walk away, keeping her distance as she had originally planned, or she could risk everything and step into the unknown, into something that could hurt her. It was a choice that scared her. She had learned the hard way not to trust people, especially men like Charles. But there was something about him, something that made her believe, just for a moment, that he was more than the monster he seemed to be. Maybe he was a man who had been broken, a man who had never known how to heal, and maybe, just maybe, Angela could help him. But helping him meant risking her own heart. It meant opening herself up to something she hadn't prepared for. "I don't know what to say," Angela said finally, her voice shaking. Charles didn't say anything. He simply stood there waiting, his face softening as he waited for her answer. For a long moment, Angela simply stared at him, the weight of her decision pressing down on her shoulders. Everything she had worked for, everything she had fought for in this strange, unfamiliar world, could be thrown away with one wrong choice. But this wasn't about survival anymore. This was about something deeper, something that could change everything. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, as if gathering the courage to make a decision that could alter the course of her life. "I'll stay," she said finally, her voice steady. "I'll stay, and I'll prove you wrong." Charles didn't smile. But for the first time, Angela saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Hope. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, and with that, Angela knew she had just made the riskiest decision of her life. Angela didn't realize how much had changed in the few days since she agreed to stay. The decision, as heavy as it had been, now felt almost instinctive. She found herself in a strange new world, one where she wasn't just a poor, starving girl. She was someone who mattered, to Charles. At least that's what she believed for now. But how long could that last? Charles didn't treat her with pity anymore. He didn't keep her at arm's length, nor did he look down on her the way others did. There was a subtle shift in his interactions with her, respect, even admiration. It wasn't enough to call it friendship, but it was a step in that direction. And for Angela, that step felt like a lifetime. But there were still things she didn't understand. Things about Charles' past and the reasons behind his cold, calculating exterior. He had made his fortune with ruthless determination, leaving a trail of enemies and unspoken regrets. Angela had been living in the house for a little, over a week when the discovery was made. The discovery that would change everything. It started innocently enough. Charles had mentioned offhandedly one evening at dinner that he had a family home out in the countryside, a place where he went to clear his head. It wasn't something he ever spoke about in detail, but Angela caught the mention and stored it, away in the back of her mind. When Charles invited her to come along on a weekend trip to the estate, her curiosity got the best of her. She wasn't sure what he expected her to do there, sit quietly, watch the scenery, or something more, but she agreed nonetheless. It was another opportunity to prove herself, to show him that she could be more than just a test subject in his strange game. The drive to the estate was long. Angela found herself staring out the window, watching the landscape change from the bustling city to quiet, open fields and forests. She could feel the weight of the silence between them, an unspoken tension that hung in the air. Charles wasn't talking much, but that was typical of him. When he did speak, it was often with purpose, as if every word had to count. When they arrived, Angela was struck by the grandeur of the place. The house was old, but beautiful, with a long driveway lined with trees and a view of a vast lake in the distance. It was the kind of place that seemed to hold secrets, memories embedded in every brick and beam. Charles led her inside, and as they entered, Angela felt a strange chill, one that had nothing to do with the temperature. Charles' mood shifted almost immediately. His eyes were darker, as though this place brought out a side of him he kept hidden from the world. The house was eerily quiet, filled with portraits of people she didn't recognize, ancestors no doubt. The air smelled faintly of dust and old wood. As they walked through the hallways, Angela could feel the weight of history in every corner. But it wasn't just the house that felt haunted, it was Charles himself. There was something about him in this space that made him seem smaller, less imposing. It was as though the place had the power to strip him of the persona he had spent years cultivating. After a while, Charles excused himself, telling her he needed to make some calls. Angela wandered through the house on her own, exploring its many rooms. She had always been good at observing, at picking up on small details others overlooked. It was in one of the sitting rooms, tucked away in a corner behind a velvet curtain, that she found the first clue. It was a box, small and nondescript, placed carefully on a shelf, hidden in the shadows. Something about it called to her and, despite herself, Angela reached for it. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside, she found a stack of old photographs, yellowed with age, and letters, lots of letters. Curiosity piqued. She sifted through them, the names of people she didn't know but who seemed significant to Charles. There were a few photos of Charles as a boy, standing with a woman who looked like his mother, though Angela couldn't be sure. There were also pictures of a girl, younger than Charles, with dark hair and a smile that seemed too bright for the somber atmosphere of the estate. The name on the back of one photograph caught her eye. Sophia. The name stirred something in Angela's mind. She had heard Charles mention a sister before, but it had always been in passing, never elaborated on. But the intensity in the photographs, the way Charles's eyes looked at the girl in the images, it made Angela wonder if there was a deeper connection here. She knew that Charles had a past, but she hadn't realized it was one that might be so deeply tied to this place. Before she could investigate further, she heard footsteps behind her. Spinning around, she saw Charles standing in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something, fear, maybe crossing his face, before he quickly masked it. "You shouldn't be going through those," he said, his voice colder than usual. Angela felt her heart race. "Why? Who is Sophia?" Charles didn't answer right away. He stepped into the room, walking past her to the shelf where she had found the box. He looked down at it for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost strained. "She was my sister," he said, his words heavy with a weight Angela couldn't fully comprehend. "She died when I was young. It was complicated." Angela didn't know what to say. She had never expected this, never imagined that Charles's story, the one he so carefully kept hidden, would be tied to such a painful memory. She wanted to ask more, but she sensed that pushing him would only make him retreat further into the walls he had built around himself. Instead, she simply nodded. "Charles," she began, her voice gentle, "I didn't mean to pry. I saw the photos and I—" "No, it is fine," he interrupted, his tone softening for the first time. He turned back to face her, his eyes no longer cold but filled with a quiet sorrow. Ivy never really talked about her, not to anyone. Angela didn't know what to do with the information, but one thing was clear: this discovery had changed the way she saw Charles. He wasn't just a millionaire with a hidden agenda. He was a man with a past, with real pain. And that pain, Angela now realized, was something she couldn't just ignore. She had taken a step closer to understanding him, but she wasn't sure if that understanding would bring them closer or tear them apart. The days following Angela's discovery at the estate were filled with an odd tension. The photographs and letters about Sophia were still fresh in her mind, but Charles had become even more closed off than usual. He barely spoke about his past, and when he did, it was as if he was speaking to himself, lost in memories he couldn't escape. Angela could sense that something was breaking inside him, and she couldn't help but wonder if it was her presence, the knowledge of his pain, that had triggered it. She had seen the cracks in his armor, the vulnerability beneath his composed exterior. And now, more than ever, she felt like she was walking on eggshells. That Friday evening, Angela was sitting by the window, watching the darkening sky over the lake, when Charles walked into the room. She hadn't heard him approach, and when she turned to face him, there was a new energy about him, one that felt more urgent, more desperate. For the first time in a long while, he didn't look like a man controlling everything around him. He looked like a man on the verge of losing control altogether. He didn't say anything immediately. Instead, he stood there, watching her, as though trying to gauge whether she was someone he could confide in or someone he should keep at arm's length. The silence was deafening, and Angela, sensing the weight of the moment, was the first to speak. "Charles," she said gently, her voice calm, trying to offer him some sort of anchor. "You don't have to keep everything locked away, you know. I'm not going anywhere." Her words hung in the air between them, and for a moment she thought he might reject them. But instead he stepped closer, his eyes hard with something that resembled both fear and regret. "There's something you need to understand," he said quietly, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of emotion that Angela hadn't heard before. "Sophia wasn't just my sister. She was the reason I did everything, the reason I became who I am today." Angela's heart skipped. "A beat, what do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Charles didn't look at her but instead stared out the window, as though the words he was about to say were far too heavy to be spoken in the room they were standing in. "She died in a car accident. When I was 16, I was supposed to be with her. I should have been the one in that car, but I wasn't T. And because of that, I promised myself I'd never be weak again, never let anyone get close enough to hurt me again." Angela could feel the weight of his words, the deep sorrow lacing them. She moved closer, wanting to say something comforting, but knowing that no words would fix the chasm between them. "Charles," his voice cracked slightly as he continued, "I buried it all. The grief, the guilt. I buried it so deep that I thought I'd never have to face it again. But then you came along, and I started to remember things I didn't want to. I started to feel again, and I am not sure if I am ready for that." Angela reached out, her hand gently resting on his arm, a silent offering of support. She didn't need to say anything. She simply let him feel her presence. Charles closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength from the touch, and then turned to face her fully. "I am afraid," he admitted, his voice low, almost inaudible. "Afraid that if I let myself care about someone again, I'll lose them, just like I lost her. And I can go through that again." Angela felt her heart ache. She had come to know Charles as a man of wealth and power, but now, in this moment, he was simply a man haunted by the ghost of his past. "You don't have to be afraid of me," she whispered. "I am not going anywhere. You don't have to carry this burden alone." He didn't say anything in response. Instead, he stood there, frozen, as though her words were slowly sinking in. Angela wasn't sure what would happen next. She didn't know if she had the power to fix him, or if he could ever fully heal. But what she did know was that she had made a connection with him, one that was raw and unspoken, a connection grounded in something deeper than her role in his strange game. For the first time since she had met Charles, Angela began to believe that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't all a test. Maybe there was something real between them. Maybe this could become something that wasn't about deception or manipulation, but about healing, trust, and perhaps even love. And that thought, terrifying as it was, began to bloom inside her chest. The days following their conversation about his past were heavy with silence. The air between Angela and Charles had shifted, but it wasn't yet clear if the change was for the better or the worse. Angela tried her best to maintain a sense of normalcy. She focused on the work around the estate, keeping her mind occupied as much as possible. She avoided the heavy topics that seemed to hover in the air whenever she was near Charles. But something had changed inside him too. He no longer shut himself off completely. He would join her for brief meals, their conversations now more meaningful, more vulnerable. However, there was still an invisible barrier between them, one he couldn't seem to cross, and neither could she. It wasn't long before the weight of their unspoken connection began to take a toll. Charles's moods fluctuated. Some days he was the man she had met, commanding, aloof, and distant. Other days he seemed to wear his emotions on his sleeve, quiet, restless, haunted. And yet, it wasn't just his emotional state that was concerning her. Something else felt off, as if he was keeping something from her. Angela had been keeping a secret of her own. She had been following the leads she had found about Sophia, the letters, the photographs, everything that had piqued her curiosity. There was a strange feeling in the pit of her stomach, something she couldn't quite explain, but it urged her to search deeper, to uncover more of what lay behind Charles's facade. One afternoon, she decided to do just that. She returned to the old study where she had first discovered the photographs of Sophia. This time, she went beyond what she had seen before, digging through Charles's personal files. opening drawers she had hesitated to touch, hoping to uncover more pieces to this puzzle. She found what she was looking for, hidden in a locked drawer, buried beneath layers of official papers. A letter. The envelope was yellowed with age, its seal broken. Angela's fingers trembled as she carefully unfolded the paper inside. The writing was neat, precise, nothing out of the ordinary at first. But as she read, her heart stopped. Charles, if you ever find this letter, know that you have betrayed me. I know what you did, and I am not going to let it pass. You thought you could bury the truth, but I will make sure it is exposed. You can't run from your past forever. It will find you. The letter was signed with a name Angela had never seen before, Lena Walker. Angela felt a chill creep down her spine. She had never heard of a Lena Walker. Who was this woman, and what truth was she speaking of? The letter seemed to hold the promise of a terrible secret. A secret that Charles had clearly gone to great lengths to keep buried. As Angela stared at the letter, a sense of unease took root in her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was the missing link, the thing Charles had been hiding from her and from everyone else. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Angela decided to confront Charles. She couldn't keep going in circles, waiting for him to open up on his own terms. She needed to know the full truth. She found him in his study, staring out the window as he often did. His posture was stiff, and the lines of weariness on his face were more pronounced than usual. When he turned to acknowledge her, there was something in his eyes, a guardedness, a silent warning. "Charles," she began, her voice steady but heavy with the weight of what she had uncovered. "I found something today. Something that I think you need to explain." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, they just stood there, each of them measuring the other, unsure of how to move forward. "What is it?" he asked quietly, his voice low, almost resigned. Angela took a deep breath, holding up the letter she had found. "Who is Lena Walker?" she asked, her eyes searching his face for any sign of recognition. The color drained from Charles's face, and for a split second, he looked like a man who had just been caught in a lie. He walked over to her slowly, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the letter. Angela held it out of his reach, not backing down. "Tell me what this means, Charles. What is going on? Who is she, and what is the truth that she is threatening to expose?" she pressed, her voice trembling slightly now, not with fear, but with the realization that she might be standing on the edge of something far darker than she had anticipated. Charles stood there for a long moment, silent, his chest rising and falling with each breath. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he sat down at his desk, his face a mask of anguish. "She was someone I tried to forget," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "Lena was someone I loved, but I betrayed her, and when she found out, she swore she would ruin me." Angela's heart pounded in her chest. She hadn't expected this. Betrayed her how? Charles's eyes darkened. "I made a choice that hurt her beyond repair. I never wanted her to find out, but she did. And in the end, I lost her, just like I lost my sister. The truth I buried wasn't just about Sophia. It was about Lena, too." Angela stepped closer, her mind racing to put the pieces together. "So, what happened to her? What's the connection between her and Sophia?" Charles's gaze flickered toward the window, and for a moment, he seemed lost in the past. "Lena left me after the accident. I never saw her again. Until recently. She came back, demanding I face what I had done. She said she would destroy everything I had built if I didn't make things right. But I couldn't, Angela. I couldn't bring myself to do it." Angela was stunned. The weight of the situation, the secrets, the lies, the unspoken pain crashed over her like a tidal wave. She had thought she understood Charles, but now she was beginning to see the extent of the darkness that had shaped him. And now she had a choice to make. "Charles," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion, "what are you going to do? You can keep running from this. Not forever." He turned back to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and fear. "I don't know what to do anymore, but I have to face the consequences. I just don't know if I'm strong enough to do it alone." Angela stood there for a long moment staring at him, her heart torn between empathy and the knowledge that everything was about to change. The days that followed the confrontation in Charles' study were heavy with an unspoken tension. Angela could feel the weight of the secrets that now hung between them. The revelation about Lena Walker, the haunting figure from Charles' past, had shaken her to the core. But it was also clear to her now, whatever the truth was, it wasn't just about Charles, it was about them, about what they could still salvage from the wreckage of their respective lives. Charles had retreated further into himself after their conversation. The distance between them was palpable. Angela, however, refused to let him spiral alone. She couldn't. Despite the fear and uncertainty that plagued her, she couldn't ignore the responsibility she felt toward him, toward the man who, even in his brokenness, had shown her kindness and trust in ways no one else had. One evening, as dusk settled over the estate, Angela made a decision. She would no longer let him drown in silence. She needed to help him face the truth, no matter how painful. She found him in the library, his back to her, staring out over the expansive grounds. The weight of the past hung in the air between them, like a storm about to break. "Charles," she said, her voice tentative but firm, "we can keep doing this. You are not alone in this." He stiffened at the sound of her voice but didn't turn around. For a moment, the room was silent, save for the sound of the wind gently rustling the trees outside. "I've been alone for a long time, Angela," he said, his voice rough as though the words were dragged from him unwillingly. "And that sees how I thought I wanted it. I didn't need anyone." Angela's heart ached as she watched his shoulders slump. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and gently placed a hand on his arm. "But now you do," she said softly. "You don't have to carry all of this by yourself anymore. I wanted to leave you." He turned to face her, and there was something in his eyes, something vulnerable and raw that she had never seen before. It was a mix of gratitude and pain, the weight of all he had lost. And yet, for the first time in years, he wasn't alone in it. Angela took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Tell me about Lena. Tell me what happened. It's time to face it together." Charles hesitated, his gaze falling to the floor. He looked defeated, as though he was carrying the burden of years in his soul. Slowly, he sank into the nearest armchair, his fingers massaging his temple as he exhaled deeply. "She wasn't just anyone," he began, his voice distant. "She was my world before everything fell apart. I loved her with a depth I can't explain, Angela, but I wasn't the man she needed me to be, and because of that, I lost her." Angela sat beside him, offering him a steady, unwavering presence. She wasn't sure what he needed right now, but she knew that what mattered was that he felt supported. "When we were younger," Charles continued, his voice quieter now, "we had dreams. She wanted to travel the world. I wanted to build a legacy. But I became obsessed with work, with proving myself. And she became frustrated, angry even. We drifted apart, but I wasn't ready to admit it. I thought if I ignored it, it would go away." He paused, his face contorting with a mix of pain and regret. "I should have seen the signs. Lena had been asking for more for my time, my attention, but I was too busy to see it. By the time I realized what I had lost, it was too late. She was already gone. And I didn't just lose her. I lost part of myself." Angela's heart twisted as she listened to him, the truth of his words cutting deep. She could hear the regret in his voice, the guilt that had haunted him all these years. But there was more, a deeper pain that she couldn't yet understand, but one that she could feel in her bones. "And Sophia?" Angela asked gently, her voice trembling slightly. "What happened with Sophia? Was Lena connected to her somehow?" Charles let out a long sigh, his eyes closing as if he were bracing himself for the storm that was about to break. Yes, he whispered. Lena and Sophia. They were both part of my past in ways I couldn't reconcile. Lena's return after all these years brought everything to the surface, and when she threatened to expose what I had done, I was forced to face the choices I had made. Sophia's death, Lena's departure. They were all linked. My failure to see the damage I caused to both of them has been my greatest regret. Angela felt as if the ground beneath her feet had shifted. She had known that Charles's past was painful, but she hadn't realized just how deep the scars went. It wasn't just about the people he had lost, it was about the mistakes he had made, the ways he had failed them, and the way he had buried it all to protect himself. But you are not that man anymore, Angela said, her voice strong now. You were not the person who ran from your mistakes. You are here. You are trying to make things right. Charles looked at her, a flicker of something hope perhaps shining in his eyes. Do you really believe that? I do, she answered without hesitation. I don't know what the future holds for us, but I do know that you're not alone anymore. We can face this together. For a long moment they just sat there in silence, the weight of everything that had been said hanging heavily in the air. Angela knew that they were only at the beginning of something far more complicated than she could fully understand. But she also knew this: they were in it together, and that in itself was the first step toward healing. As Charles looked at her, his face softening, a small genuine smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Thank you, Angela, he said quietly. You're right. I don't want to carry this alone anymore. And for the first time in years, Angela believed that perhaps, just perhaps, he was ready to let go of his past and face the future. The weeks following their conversation in the library felt like a slow unraveling of everything Charles had built up over the years. He was no longer the man he had once been, and for the first time in ages, Angela could sense that he was genuinely searching for redemption. But the road to redemption was neither straight nor easy. Each day brought new challenges, new fears, and, most notably, the specter of Lena Walker, looming larger with every passing hour. Charles had been evasive when it came to Lena, still unwilling to confront her directly. Angela knew, however, that the time had come. She had seen the same haunted look in his eyes every time her name was mentioned. But now, Charles had to decide. Would he finally face Lena and put his past to rest, or would he allow the ghosts to continue tormenting him? Angela wasn't as sure if she was ready for the storm that was about to break, but she was determined to stand by his side when it did. They both had secrets, both had regrets that were pulling them in different directions, but the one thing Angela knew was that neither of them could keep running from the truth. One evening after dinner, when the world outside had been swallowed by the darkness, Charles turned to Angela with an expression of deep resolve. I need to see her, he said, his voice low but resolute. It is time. Angela's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment they'd both been avoiding. Are you sure? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Charles nodded, his jaw set, but there was an unmistakable flicker of fear in his eyes. I don't think I have a choice anymore. Lena needs to hear the truth and I need to tell it. Angela could see the burden in his face. This wasn't just about confronting Lena. It was about confronting everything Charles had buried within himself, and that made the decision all the more difficult. The next day, after a restless night, they set out for the meeting. Charles had arranged for Lena to meet him at a small secluded cafe just outside the city. It was the same cafe they used to frequent before their lives had become tangled in their own messes. The memory of those days felt like a distant dream now, almost reachable. As they approached the cafe, Angela felt her chest tighten. She wasn't just nervous for Charles, she was nervous for herself. Would Lena recognize her role in this mess? Would she see Angela as just another complication in Charles's already tumultuous life? They arrived to find Lena already seated at a corner table, her figure unmistakable despite the years that had passed. She looked exactly the way Charles had described her, tall, poised, and undeniably beautiful. But there was a hardness in her eyes now, an edge that hadn't been there before. Angela could tell at a glance that Lena was no longer the woman Charles had once loved. time had changed her, just as it had changed him. Lena looked up as they approached, her gaze immediately locking onto Charles with a mixture of warmth and disdain. It was clear that this meeting wasn't going to be easy for either of them. "Charles," Lena said coolly, her voice carrying a hint of bitterness. "I wasn't expecting you to come. I didn't think you had the courage to face me again." Charles' lips pressed into a thin line. "I didn't come here to rehash the past, Lena," he said, his voice steady but edged with emotion. "I came here to tell you the truth. All of it." Lena's eyes narrowed, and Angela could feel the tension between them growing thicker with every passing second. "I don't need your pity, Charles," Lena snapped, leaning back in her chair. "I've already moved on from whatever we had. It doesn't matter anymore." Angela, who had been standing silently beside Charles, stepped forward. "It does matter," she said, softly but firmly. "You can just pretend like none of this ever happened. The pain, the lies, it all matters. It is the only way you two can move forward." Lena turned her gaze to Angela, her expression softening just a little. "And you are?" "Angela," she replied, her voice trembling only slightly. "I've been with Charles for the past few months. I know what he's been carrying with him." For a moment, Lena seemed taken aback by Angela's words. She studied her closely, as if measuring her presence in a way she hadn't with Charles. Angela stood her ground, unwilling to back down. Lena exhaled sharply and turned her attention back to Charles. "So, you are not alone anymore," she said, her voice laced with sarcasm. "You've found someone new to burden with your guilt?" Charles' face hardened, but he didn't flinch. "No, I've found someone who understands me, who understands that I need to face the things I've been running from." There was a long pause, and for a moment, it seemed like neither Lena nor Charles could find the words they needed. Angela's heart raced in her chest. She had been waiting for this confrontation, but now that it was happening, she didn't know if any of them were ready for the fallout. "You think that confronting the past will make everything better?" Lena said, her voice tinged with both bitterness and sorrow. "You can undo what's been done, Charles. You can just wish everything away with a few words." Charles' fists clenched at his sides, his face pale, but he didn't break. "I am not asking for forgiveness," he said quietly. "I am asking for closure. I've been living in a prison of my own making. I want out." Lena's eyes flickered, and for a brief moment, Angela thought she saw a hint of vulnerability in her. But it was gone in the blink of an eye, replaced with coldness once more. "So what now?" Lena asked, her tone hardening. "Are we just supposed to walk away from everything we once were?" Angela's heart ached as she watched the two of them struggle with their past. This was their moment to heal, but it seemed like neither of them knew how to take the first step. Charles exhaled sharply, his voice breaking slightly as he spoke. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Lena, but I need to do this for myself, for my future. I can't carry this guilt anymore." Lena's expression softened just the faintest bit, but the anger still simmered beneath the surface. "You never learned how to let people in, did you, Charles?" she said, her voice quieter now. "You pushed everyone away, me, your own flesh and blood, and now you wonder why you left standing alone?" Angela could feel the weight of those words pressing down on her, and for the first time since their arrival, she understood something crucial. This was about more than Charles' guilt. It was about his inability to truly love, to truly open himself to others. Lena had been his test, and he had failed. But Angela wasn't to Lena. She was the one who was still here, still trying to help him heal. "You are not alone anymore, Charles," Angela said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. "And I won't let you face this alone either." Charles looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude before turning back. To Lena one last time. "Goodbye, Lena," he said softly. "I hope you find the peace I couldn't give you." Lena's lips tightened, but she said nothing in return as they stood and left the cafe, the weight of their past finally beginning to lift, just a little. It had been days since Charles and Angela's painful confrontation with Lena, and the aftermath was still fresh. The weight of their shared past clung to them like a shadow, always there, no matter how much they tried to move forward. Angela had stayed by his side as promised, but Charles had yet to truly free himself from the chains of his former life. He was different, yes, but he wasn't a whole not yet. Charles had been withdrawn for the past few days, lost in his thoughts and memories, and Angela had sensed that something was looming on the horizon. His battle with Lena had been the beginning of something, but it hadn't been the end. She had no idea what that something was, but she could feel it, an invisible weight that pressed heavier on Charles every time he looked out the window, every time his thoughts drifted. On a stormy evening, as the rain poured down in sheets and lightning illuminated the sky, the phone rang. Angela glanced at Charles, who was still pacing nervously around the living room, but he didn't move to answer it. Angela picked up the receiver, her fingers trembling just slightly as she pressed it to her ear. "Hello?" she said, her voice steady. For a moment, there was only silence on the other end. Then a familiar voice broke the stillness. "Angela. It's Will." Angela's stomach dropped at the sound of the name. Will Carter, one of Charles's old friends from his business past. A name she hadn't heard in years, and one she certainly hadn't expected to hear now. "Will?" she asked, trying to mask the shock in her voice. "Where have you been? We haven't heard from you in forever." There was a pause, a shift in the air, and Angela could almost hear Will's hesitant breath on the other end. I need to see Charles," Will said, his voice low and urgent. "It is important." Angela exchanged a quick glance with Charles, who had frozen at the mention of Will's name. His eyes narrowed, the color draining from his face. "What is it, Will?" Angela pressed, a sense of foreboding curling in her stomach. "There's something you need to know." Will's voice cracked, his words laced with tension. "I think you're all in danger, Angela." And Charles, he set the heart of it all. Angela's blood ran cold, and before she could ask any more questions, Will hung up abruptly. Charles's gaze was unwavering, his face pale. He had known this moment would come. He had been bracing for it. "That acid isn't it?" Angela asked, her heart pounding in her chest. "You were not just running from Lena, there's more to your past, Charles. More than you've told me. What aren't you saying?" Charles let out a long, exhausted sigh. He sank into the chair by the window, his hands clasped together tightly. "I knew this day would come," he muttered, more to himself than to Angela. "I just didn't think it would come like this." Angela knelt beside him, her hands gently resting on his. "What is it, Charles? What's going on? Who is Will, and why does he think we're in danger?" Charles's eyes filled with a storm of emotions, and for the first time in weeks, he seemed to truly collapse, the weight of everything finally taking its toll. He looked at Angela with a deep, haunted gaze. "Will's not just a friend, Angela. He's not someone I trusted, but he betrayed me. And the betrayal, it wasn't just a simple mistake. It was a life-altering decision that changed everything. Will was the one who was supposed to protect me, but he didn't. Instead, he used my downfall for his own gain." Angela's heart raced as she absorbed the words. Betrayal? What had Charles done that was so terrible, so dangerous, that it had now come back to haunt him? The fact that Will had disappeared for so many years, and now suddenly reappeared with threats of danger, made the whole situation even more chilling. "You mean Will's involved in something criminal, don't you?" she asked softly, her voice breaking through the silence. Charles nodded grimly. "I never thought he'd go that far. But he did. He betrayed me, manipulated the system, and got away with it. And now I think he's doing the same thing again with someone else. Only this time, Angela, the stakes are much higher." Angela could feel the heaviness of the moment, the gravity of Charles's past threatening to consume him once more. His secrets, long buried, were clawing their way back into the light, and with them came a dangerous enemy. "There's more to this," Charles continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think we'll ever stop trying to bring me down. After everything that happened, he disappeared, but I think he's been watching me. And now he wants something from me, something I'm not willing to give. The realization struck Angela like a bolt of lightning. What does he want, Charles? What could he possibly want from you now? Charles' face contorted with pain, the weight of his past evident in every line of his expression. The one thing that has been in my possession all these years, the one thing I could never let go of. My company. My legacy. Angela's breath caught in her throat. You think Will wants your company? Your empire? Charles shook his head. No, I think Will wants to destroy everything I've worked for. And he is not the only one. I've made enemies, Angela. Powerful ones. People who want to see me fall, and they'll do whatever it takes to make it happen. But I can let them win. Not now. Not when I've finally come this far. Angela's eyes widened in horror as the full extent of the danger hit her. This was not just about confronting the ghosts of his past. This was about survival, before they could even process the weight of Charles' words. The doorbell rang, and the atmosphere in the room shifted in an instant. The moment they had been dreading, the moment of confrontation, was upon them. Charles stood frozen, his hand gripping the back of the chair as the doorbell rang a second time. It was an urgent, insistent sound that seemed to echo throughout the house. Angela's eyes flicked nervously between the door and Charles, whose jaw was clenched, his face drained of color. I can deface him right now, Charles muttered under his breath, as though trying to convince himself. But Angela knew that. This was a confrontation he couldn't avoid. She could see the fear in his eyes, fear not just of Will, but of the truth that was long buried in his past. She took a deep breath and moved towards him, her hand resting gently on his arm. You don't have to do this alone, Angela said softly. But you do have to face him. You can keep running, Charles. Not from him and not from yourself. Charles turned his eyes toward her, a flicker of something, maybe gratitude, maybe uncertainty shining through the storm that clouded his expression. So you've been running for so long, Angela. You have no idea what I've done to survive, to protect myself. Angela's gaze softened as she stepped closer. She could sense that this moment, this doorbell, represented more than just Will showing up at their doorstep. It was the culmination of years of guilt, mistakes, and missed opportunities. It was a test of everything Charles had been trying to rebuild in his life, and it had arrived when they least expected it. It's time to stop running, she said quietly. You're not that man anymore. The words seemed to echo in the room, hanging in the air between them. Charles closed his eyes as if allowing the weight of those words to settle deep within him. He had been given a second chance at life, a chance to rewrite his story, to redeem himself. But this confrontation with Will threatened to tear it all down. He wasn't sure if he could face his past without losing the fragile piece he had fought so hard to build. Don't know if I can do this, Angela, he confessed, his voice shaking. I've hurt too many people. I've betrayed too many. Angela looked at him with compassion, her voice steady and unwavering. The man you were isn't the man standing here now, Charles. I believe in you. I've seen who you are now. You can face this, and I'll be right there with you. Charles' heart tightened as he heard her words, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. The doorbell rang once more, and this time Charles stood. He knew there was no turning back, no more hiding. He straightened his back, took a deep breath, and nodded to Angela, a silent acknowledgement of her support. Together, they moved toward the door. As Charles opened it, Will stood on the threshold, his eyes cold and calculating. There was no warmth in his smile, no hint of the friendship they once shared. Instead, his presence seemed like an icy reminder of everything Charles had tried to forget. Will looked Charles up and down, his gaze lingering on the scars, both visible and invisible, that defined him now. I see you've been busy, Will said, his tone dripping with disdain. Building a new life, or at least pretending to. Charles didn't flinch. He knew Will was trying to get under his skin, to provoke him. But this time, it didn't work. I am not the same man I was, Will, Charles replied, his voice calm but firm, and I am done running from my past. So, if you're here to finish what you started, get to the point. Will chuckled, a humorless sound. You've always been so direct, Charles. Always. So sure of yourself. But you are in over your head now. Do you really think you can hide from your mistakes forever? Charles' chest tightened as Will's words hit their mark. He had tried to outrun his mistakes, tried to bury them beneath layers of success and wealth, but they were always lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to resurface. And now here it was, the reckoning. I am not hiding anymore, Charles said, his voice steady, though the weight of Will's words gnawed at him. What do you want, Will? Will's lips curled into a smug grin. What do I want? It is simple, really. I want what's mine, Charles, and I want you to pay for the lies you've been living. Angela stepped forward, her presence a silent force at Charles. She sighed. You're not going to threaten him anymore, she said, her voice strong and unyielding. Will's eyes flickered toward Angela, and for the briefest moment, a spark of recognition passed through his gaze. But then it was gone, replaced by the same cold detachment that had defined him all those years ago. He turned his attention back to Charles. I don't need to threaten you, Charles. I just need to remind you of what you've lost, and what's coming. For you can outrun this forever. Charles swallowed hard. He wanted to fight back, to push Will away, to tell him that everything was different now. But something in Will's eyes told him that the battle was far from over. The stakes had just been raised. I want to let you destroy everything Ivy built, Charles said, his voice trembling with a mix of defiance and fear. Will's grin widened. We'll see about that. With a final lingering look, Will turned and walked away, disappearing into the stormy night. The door clicked shut behind him, and Charles exhaled, as though he had been holding his breath the entire time. Angela stood by his side, her hand resting on his shoulder. What happens now? She asked softly. Charles didn't answer immediately. He was still processing the confrontation, still feeling the weight of Will's words. The past had caught up with him, and now he had no choice but to face the consequences. But there was one thing he knew for sure. He wasn't going to let Will or anyone else take away what he had worked so hard to rebuild. I don't know, Charles, finally said, his voice quiet. But I'm not giving up without a fight, and with that, he turned away from the door and faced Angela, the two of them standing together, ready to confront whatever came next. The weeks following Will's visit were a blur for Charles. His mind was consumed by the words that still echoed in his ears. He knew deep down that Will's return wasn't just about money or revenge. It was about something far darker, something personal. Will was a ghost from Charles's past, a reminder of the man he once was, the man he feared he could become again. Charles spent long hours reflecting on his past, digging through the memories he had buried so deeply. It wasn't just about the business, deals gone wrong, the friendships destroyed by lies, or the way he had abandoned his moral compass for the sake of ambition. No, the real damage was far worse. He had left behind a trail of people who trusted him, people who loved him. And Will was the person who had been closest to him in the days before everything fell apart. That was what made this confrontation so inevitable. Will wasn't just a threat to Charles's wealth or reputation. He was a reminder of a life Charles had abandoned, a life he thought he had escaped. But no matter how hard Charles tried to push these thoughts aside, they kept coming back. His nights were filled with restless sleep, haunted by nightmares of the past. And in those dreams, Will's face was always there, mocking him, reminding him that no matter how much he changed, the past was never really gone. One rainy afternoon, Angela found Charles sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the photograph of himself and Will from years ago. They had been inseparable back then, two young, ambitious men chasing dreams and making deals that would change their lives forever. Now, that bond seemed like a distant memory, overshadowed by betrayal, deceit, and the irreparable damage that had been done. Angela placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, and Charles looked up, his face weary and conflicted. I need to do something about this, he said quietly, his voice filled with resolve. I can't let Will control my life any longer. Angela nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. But you can do it alone, Charles. This isn't just about facing Will, it is about confronting everything you've been running from. The man you used to be, the things you've done. You can outrun them forever. Charles exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. I know. I don't know where to start. How do I face all of this? How do I make amends for what I've done? Angela sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. Start with yourself. You've spent so much time trying to be someone else, trying to outrun the man you were, but that person is still part of you. And until you accept that, until you forgive yourself, you can't move forward. You can't keep running. The weight of her words settled heavily in his chest. Charles had spent so many years building a facade, pretending to be someone he wasn't, and now it was all crumbling. Will had forced him to confront the truth he had been avoiding for so long. I don't know if I can forgive myself, Angela, he confessed, his voice breaking with emotion. I've hurt so many people. I've done things I can take back. Angela reached across the table, her hand covering his. You wouldn't have to fix everything all at once. It is a process, but you can start by taking responsibility, by owning your mistakes. Charles looked at her, his eyes filled with pain and uncertainty. But what if it's too late? What if I've already lost everything? Angela's voice softened. It is never too late, Charles. As long as you are still breathing, there's always a chance for redemption. The words hung in the air between them, a lifeline for Charles in his sea of doubt. He hadn't fully realized it until now, but Angela was right. Redemption wasn't something that happened overnight. It was a journey. And that journey had to begin with him facing the truth, embracing the man he had been, and accepting that the person he was becoming didn't have to be defined by his past mistakes. But even as he made this decision, Charles knew that the hardest part was still ahead. He would have to face the ghost of the man he once was, and deal with the consequences of everything they had done together. The next morning, Charles stood in front of the mirror, his eyes locked on his reflection. For the first time in a long time, he didn't see the wealthy businessman, the man who had everything. He saw a man who had lost so much but who was still standing, still fighting. Today, it begins, he whispered to himself. Later that day, Charles drove to the address he had scribbled down on a piece of paper, the address of the building that housed Will's law firm. His heart pounded in his chest as he parked in front of the tall, imposing structure. The rain had subsided, but the storm inside Charles's mind was far from over. He stepped out of the car, the cold wind biting at his skin, and made his way toward the entrance. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of his past was pressing down on him. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Not now. When he entered the building, the receptionist looked up, her face neutral as she greeted him. How can I help you, sir? I am here to see William Hawke, Charles said, his voice steady but laced with a hint of uncertainty. The receptionist's eyes widened slightly. Mr. Hawke is expecting you, she said, her tone changing subtly. Please follow me. Charles followed her through the sleek modern hallways, his mind racing. What would he say to Will? What could he say? And what if Will was still the same ruthless, manipulative man he had been all those years ago? Finally, the receptionist stopped in front of a door and knocked twice before opening it. Mr. Hawke will see you now. Will was seated behind a large desk, his back turned toward the door. When he heard the sound of the door opening, he turned slowly, his face impassive. Charles, Will said with a cold smile, I wondered how long it would take you to show up. I assume you've come to make amends. Charles stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew this was the moment, this was the confrontation he had been dreading. I've come to face you, Charles said quietly, to face the truth of who I was and who I've become. Will raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. And what truth would that be? The truth that I've spent my life running from, Charles replied, his voice steady. The truth that I can't hide from anymore. Will's smile faltered for a moment, replaced by a look of genuine curiosity. Well then, let us hear it. Charles took a deep breath. This was it, the moment he had been preparing for. I was wrong, Will. I made mistakes, I hurt people, and I've spent years trying to bury it all. But I can keep pretending. I can keep running. Will leaned forward in his chair, his eyes narrowing. And what exactly do you want from me, Charles? Forgiveness? Redemption? Do you honestly think I am going to forgive you for everything you've done? Charles met his gaze, unwavering. I am not asking for your forgiveness. I am asking for the chance to make things right. Will's expression shifted, no longer amused. You think you can fix this? You think you can just waltz back into my life and make everything okay? Charles didn't flinch. I know I can fix everything, but I can try. There was a long silence between them. Will's face was unreadable, but Charles could feel the tension in the room thick, suffocating, as if the very air had changed. Finally, Will spoke, his voice low and dangerous. You're too late, Charles. You've lost your chance. There's no going back. Charles swallowed hard, but he didn't back down. Maybe you were right, but that doesn't mean I want to try. And with that, he turned and walked out of the office, his footsteps echoing in the cold, sterile hallway. Charles sat in his car for a long time, the engine running but his mind far from the present. The rain had started again, softly tapping on the windshield as if the heavens themselves were weeping for him. His conversation with Will had left him feeling hollow, like he had just poured his heart out to a man who had no intention of listening. Will's words echoed in his mind. You've lost your chance. There's no going back. That was the moment Charles had been dreading, the moment he realized that Will was no longer the man he had once known. Will had changed, and so had Charles. But it wasn't just Will he had to face, it was everything he had done. The deals, the betrayals, the people he had hurt along the way. For all the wealth he had accumulated, for all the power he had achieved, it had come at an unimaginable cost. And now, standing on the precipice of everything he had built, Charles knew that he couldn't keep running from it. If he wanted to truly redeem himself, it wouldn't come from the apologies of the past, or the money he had hoarded. It would come from one final, decisive act. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, the muscles in his hand aching from the tension. There was only one thing left to do. He had to make a sacrifice. The next day, Charles walked into his office with a clear sense of purpose. He had made his decision. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be popular, but it was necessary. He had lived his life in pursuit of power and wealth, but now he was going to use everything he had to undo the harm he had caused. The first step was to call in his lawyer. Marcus, I need you to draft a new will, Charles said, his voice firm. And I need it done today. Marcus looked up from his desk, his brow furrowing at the seriousness in Charles's tone. A new will? Charles, you're in good health. Why the sudden change? Charles sighed, rubbing his temples. It's not about health. It's about legacy. I need to make things right. I want to ensure that everything I've worked for, everything I've built, goes to the people who deserve it. I want it all to go to the causes that matter, not to my name, not to my empire. Marcus stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. You're serious about this, aren't you? I am, Charles said, his voice steady. This is the only way to redeem myself for everything I've done. I need to leave something good behind, something that will matter. Marcus nodded slowly, clearly understanding the gravity of the situation. I'll get started on it right away. As Marcus began to type, Charles stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the city. He had everything a man could want: wealth, influence, power. But none of it mattered. None of it could fix what he had broken. His thoughts drifted to Angela. She had been his rock, his constant support. She had always believed in him, even when he couldn't believe in himself. But he knew this decision would shake her to the core. He couldn't tell her about it, not yet. Not until it was done. That evening, Charles met with the board of his company, the ones who had watched him climb to the top and those he had left behind in the process. They didn't know what was coming. "Gentlemen," Charles began, his voice calm but resolute, "I've made a decision. I am stepping down as CEO of this company." A murmur spread through the room. He could see the shock in their eyes, the disbelief. "What?" one of the board members asked, his voice filled with confusion. "You can be serious. This is your company, your legacy." Charles met their gazes one by one. It is time for change. It is time for someone who hasn't been blinded by power to take over. Ivy spent too many years chasing the wrong things, and I can, in good conscience, continue running this company knowing the damage Ivy caused. Can just walk away, another board member shouted. "What will happen to the company? To us?" Charles didn't flinch. "The company will survive. It's as strong. But I want to be a part of it anymore." He stood up, his back straight, his heart pounding in his chest. He had already made the arrangements. The company was being placed under the management of a new CEO, a person who valued integrity over profit, who understood the true meaning of success. The room was filled with stunned silence, but Charles didn't wait for a response. He walked out, leaving behind everything he had built. His name, his empire, it didn't matter anymore. What mattered now was the life he had ahead of him. A life that, for the first time in years, felt like it might have a chance at redemption. The next few days were a whirlwind. News of Charles' decision spread quickly, and soon, the media was buzzing with reports about the sudden resignation of the once powerful CEO. There were headlines questioning his motives, speculating about his reasons, but Charles didn't care. He had done what he needed to do. Angela, however, wasn't as quick to understand. She had always been his support, his partner in everything, but this decision rocked her. She couldn't understand why he had chosen to throw everything away, to give up the empire they had built together. "Charles, why?" she asked one night, her voice full of pain and confusion. "Why did you do this?" Charles took her hand, his eyes filled with regret and love. "I had to, Angela. I had to give up everything to make it right. The company, the money, it's all just a distraction. What matters now is the people I've hurt, the lives I've ruined." Angela's eyes softened, though her voice trembled. "But what about us? What about our future?" "I'm not throwing everything away," Charles said, his voice gentle but firm. "I am starting over. With you, with the right intentions. I want to build a life that matters, a life we can be proud of." Angela looked into his eyes, searching for the man she once knew, the man who had been so consumed by ambition. And in that moment she saw him. He was still there, but changed. It was as if the weight of the past had lifted from his shoulders, and for the first time he was free. She nodded slowly, tears brimming in her eyes. "I'll stand by you, Charles, no matter what." He smiled, feeling a sense of peace that he hadn't known in years. "Thank you, Angela. This is just the beginning. I know I can't undo everything, but I can try. And that's what I am going to do." As Charles made his final preparations, he knew that the hardest part was still to come. He would have to confront Will, the man who had once been his closest ally, but who now stood as a symbol of everything he had done wrong. But as he stood on the edge of this new beginning, Charles realized something important. Redemption wasn't about undoing the past. It was about making peace with it. And with Angela by his side, he finally felt ready to face whatever came next. The night was quiet, but the weight of the world seemed to press down on Charles as he stood outside the door to Will's office. The sky above was pitch black, with only a sliver of moonlight peeking through the clouds, casting an eerie glow on the building's glass facade. His heart pounded in his chest, the final step of his redemption looming before him like an unspeakable burden. This wasn't just a meeting, it was a reckoning. Charles had come to understand something profound over the past few days. He had sought redemption through actions, through grand gestures like giving away his fortune and stepping down from the company. But redemption, he now realized, wasn't simply about giving things away or making amends on the surface. It was about confronting the hardest truths of his own life, especially the things he had done to the people closest to him. Will had been his best friend once. They had built everything together. But now, Will was the very person he needed to make amends with, the one he had betrayed the most. It wasn't just about the business deals or the manipulation, it was about the personal betrayal, the trust he had broken. Taking a deep breath, Charles knocked on the door. His fist seemed to hesitate in midair for a moment, but then he let it fall. "Come in," came Will's cold voice from inside. Charles turned the handle and stepped into the office. The room was dimly lit, the only source of light being the soft glow of a desk lamp, which cast long shadows across the space. Will was seated at his desk, his posture as rigid and unyielding as ever. His face, however, lacked the familiar warmth it once held when Charles had walked into a room. Instead, there was only a cold, indifferent mask that now seemed to define him. "Charles," Will said, his voice neutral. "I didn't expect you to show up. You've already made your decisions, haven't you?" "I have," Charles replied quietly. He closed the door behind him and took a step forward, his gaze fixed on his old friend. There was a moment of silence between them, filled only with the tension of unresolved history. Will leaned back in his chair, his fingers interlaced. "So what is this? Are you here to try to explain yourself, to justify what you've done?" Charles shook his head. "No, I am not here to justify anything. I am here to apologize, and to tell you that I am leaving everything behind." Will raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. Leaving everything behind. And what exactly does that mean? You think stepping down from the company makes everything right? Charles nodded, his voice steady. "Not everything, no. But it's the only thing I can do. You've done so much damage, Will. I've hurt so many people along the way, including you. I used you, I manipulated you. I am ashamed of who I became, and I can undo that no matter how much I try." There was a long pause before Will finally spoke. Again, his voice bitter. "Do you really think that stepping down will make it all better? That walking away from the empire we built together will undo everything?" Charles hesitated, but then the words came out, raw and honest. "No. But it's a start. I've spent my entire life focused on building something that in the end only hurt people. All the wealth, all the power, it never meant anything, not in the end. Doesn't matter if I was the richest man in the world if I lost the people I care about." Will's face softened, just slightly, but his eyes still held a trace of anger. "You think I'm one of those people you care about? After everything? After everything you've done to me, to us, do you really think you can just walk back into my life and apologize and think everything is going to be okay?" Charles stepped closer, his voice quiet but firm. "I am not asking for forgiveness, Will. I am not asking for things to go back to how they were. I am just telling you the truth. I hurt you, and I am sorry for it. But what I am doing now is for you, for everyone I've wronged. I am sacrificing everything to try to do the right thing." Will's eyes darkened as he took in Charles' words. "And what exactly is your sacrifice? Giving away your fortune? Stepping down from your company? That's your redemption, Charles?" Charles nodded slowly. "It is the only thing I can do to make it right. But there's more. There is something else I need to do." Will leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "What is it?" Charles met his gaze, his eyes filled with both determination and sorrow. "I am going to give up my claim to the company entirely. I am going to make sure it has passed on to someone who deserves it. Someone who hasn't been tainted by the kind of greed and ambition that I've lived with for so long." Will stared at him, disbelief evident in his eyes. "You were serious?" "I am, Charles," replied. "I can undo the past, Will, but I can make sure that no one else is harmed by my mistakes. And that's the one thing I can still control." For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Will sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Charles waited, his heart heavy in his chest. hoping that somewhere deep inside his friend would understand. He didn't expect forgiveness, but he hoped for something. A sign that maybe, just maybe, he had done the right thing. Will's voice broke, the silence quiet but laced with emotion. You've already sacrificed everything, Charles, but I don't think you fully understand what it means to truly sacrifice. You're willing to give away the company, your fortune, your power, but the real sacrifice, the one that will make the difference, is when you give up the one thing you still have left. The one thing that will cost you everything. Charles' breath caught in his throat. What do you mean? Will's eyes locked onto his, and for the first time in a long while, there was no anger, no bitterness. Just the raw honesty of a man who had been through as much as Charles had. The real sacrifice, Charles, is when you give up the one thing that you can replace your pride, your ego, your need for control. That's what you need to let go of if you want to truly change. Charles felt the weight of Will's words settle over him like a heavy blanket. He had given up so much already, but he hadn't yet given up the most important thing, the thing that had driven every decision he made, every betrayal he had committed, his pride. The realization hit him like a tidal wave, and for the first time in years, Charles felt the floodgates of emotion break open. The man he had been, the person who had destroyed so many lives, was still inside him, but now, he could see the path to redemption. He could see what he needed to do. And in that moment, Charles knew that the ultimate sacrifice wasn't just about what he gave up on the outside. It was about what he was willing to release on the inside. It was his pride, his need for control, his arrogance. He had to let it all go. The days following Charles' realization were filled with a strange kind of clarity. He woke up each morning with the weight of his past still on his shoulders, but somehow it felt lighter, as if he had made room for something new, something better. The first step was the hardest, reconnecting with the people he had hurt, the employees at his company. The ones who had once respected him had now become strangers, distant and wary. He knew that the road ahead would be long and filled with skepticism, but he was willing to face it head on. He had reached out to everyone, those who had been loyal to him in the past, those who had suffered because of his greed, those who had believed in his vision and had since seen it crumble. Charles knew it. It was time to rebuild, but not with the same foundation that had brought him to where he was. He had to start from scratch in every sense. One by one, the meetings began. The first was with Emily, the woman who had once worked as his personal assistant, and who had been the first to notice the cracks in his persona. She was now the director of operations, a position she had earned when Charles had chosen to distance himself from the business. She had been wary of his call, unsure whether he was coming back to claim his throne or simply to do more damage. When she stepped into his office, Charles was sitting at his desk, but his posture was different now. His shoulders were no longer hunched with the weight of ambition. Instead, he was sitting with his hands clasped in front of him, as if preparing to listen. "Emily," he said softly, his voice a stark contrast to the commanding tone she remembered. "I am not here to ask for your forgiveness. I don't even expect you to trust me right now. But I am asking for a chance to show you that I can be better, that I am better." Emily stood there for a moment, her arms crossed, eyes narrowing as she tried to gauge whether he was truly sincere. She had seen him at his worst, arrogant, dismissive, power-hungry. But now, standing before her, there was something different. It was a quiet humility, an acknowledgement of the harm he had caused, and for the first time it felt real. "I don't know if I can just forget everything," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I am willing to give you a chance. Just don't let us down again." It wasn't much, but it was a start. Emily's forgiveness, however tentative, marked the beginning of something Charles had not dared to believe in for a long time: redemption. The next step was harder. He had to face his board of directors. These were the people who had turned a blind eye to his manipulations, who had blindly followed his lead as the company grew under his control. They had seen his ambition as something to admire, not something to question. But now, with everything in disarray, Charles knew they wouldn't just let him waltz back in and pick up the pieces. He called a meeting, one that would change everything. The boardroom was tense, everyone seated around the large polished table, their eyes fixed on him with suspicion. Charles stood at the head of the table, his hands resting on the surface as he faced the group. He wasn't the same man who had once ruled this room, the man who had commanded respect with arrogance and force. Now, he was humble, quiet, and for the first time in years, he was ready to listen. "I owe each and every one of you an apology," he began, his voice steady but laden with emotion. "I used all of you. I took advantage of your trust, and I exploited the power I had to make decisions that hurt not just this company, but everyone who believed in it." There was a murmur of surprise from the board, and Charles saw the flicker of disbelief in their eyes. They had been expecting a return to the same old Charles, a man with grand plans and empty promises. But this time, he wasn't offering promises. He was offering the truth. "I am not asking for your forgiveness," he continued, his gaze shifting from one face to the next. "I don't deserve it. But what I am asking for is a chance to make things right, and that starts by stepping down completely. I want nothing more to do with this company. It's time for someone else to take the reins, someone who hasn't been tainted by greed, who can lead with integrity." The silence in the room was palpable. No one spoke for what felt like an eternity. Finally, one of the older board members, a man named Gregory, cleared his throat. "Charles," Gregory said, his voice heavy with years of experience, "you've come to us today with something we never expected, a self-awareness we didn't think you had. But I'll be honest, this is not just about you stepping down. We need to see action. We need to see results. We need to know that you've truly changed." Charles nodded. "I understand, and I will prove it. I don't expect you to trust me overnight, but I will spend the rest of my life proving to you that I can be better." For the first time in years, Charles felt a flicker of hope ignite within him. The path ahead was still uncertain, but it was a path he was willing to walk, no matter how hard it would be. Over the next few weeks, Charles worked tirelessly to set things in motion. He sold off assets that had once been his prized possessions, donating the proceeds to charities focused on youth education and mental health. He met with employees from all levels of the company, listening to their concerns, acknowledging their pain, and offering his sincerest apologies. He reached out to people he had wronged in his personal life, offering them the same humility and sincerity. But the most challenging part was yet to come. He had to face the most painful consequence of all, the loss of his family. His wife, Olivia, had stood by him through his rise to power, but she had also witnessed the destruction he had caused. Their marriage had been strained for years, and he knew that no amount of redemption could fix what had been broken between them. He found Olivia one evening, sitting alone in the garden of their estate, the fading light of the day casting long shadows across her face. She didn't look up when he approached, but he knew she had heard him coming. "Olivia," he said softly, kneeling beside her, "I've done so much wrong. I know I can change the past, but I'm trying. I am doing everything I can to make it right." Olivia's voice was barely a whisper as she responded, "I don't know, Charles. I don't know if you can fix everything. You've hurt so many people. I don't even know if I can believe in you anymore." Charles reached for her hand, his heart aching at the coldness that lingered between them. "I don't expect you to believe in me right away, but I will spend the rest of my life proving that I am worthy of your trust, of your love, and of the family we once had." For a long time, Olivia said nothing. Then, slowly, she turned her hand over, allowing his to meet hers. It was a small gesture, but to Charles, it felt like a miracle. "We'll take it one step at a time," she said, her voice trembling. And that was all he needed. One step at a time. The days that followed Charles's decision to step down were nothing short of transformative. The road to redemption was long, filled with obstacles. But for the first time in his life, he was moving in the right direction. Not because he sought praise or wealth, but because he wanted to make amends. He wanted to prove, not just to the world but to himself, that he was capable of change. Charles knew that his past was a scar he couldn't erase, but it didn't have to define him. Every interaction, every apology, every action he took was a step closer to shedding the man he used to be. And slowly, very slowly, he was beginning to rebuild not just his reputation, but his sense of self. It was a quiet Sunday morning when he received the call that would change everything. He had been at the kitchen table with Olivia, sharing a rare moment of peace with her. After months of tension, their relationship had started to heal, though the road ahead was still uncertain. They spoke more now, laughed more, even shared memories of times when their life had been simpler. There was no rush. There was no expectation. They were taking it one day at a time, learning to trust again. The phone rang, interrupting their conversation. Charles glanced at the screen, an unfamiliar number. He hesitated for a moment, then answered. "Hello? Charles. It's Emily." His heart skipped a beat. Emily? It had been weeks since they last spoke, and though he had reached out to many of the employees, Emily had been particularly distant. There was still a trust that needed to be rebuilt between them, but her voice now carried a tone that wasn't so guarded. It was soft, but there was something hopeful about it. "Emily, what is going on?" Charles asked. "I'm calling because I've been watching what you've been doing, the changes you were making, and I wanted to tell you something important." His pulse quickened. "What is it?" "I've spoken with the board," Emily continued. "They've agreed to give you a second chance, not just for you, but for the company. They believe you can lead it back to its original vision, one of integrity. They're willing to put their trust in you again." Charles felt the weight of her words sink in. The board? Trust him again? This was something he had never expected, especially after everything he had done. He'd spent so much time focused on rebuilding himself that he hadn't even considered the possibility of returning to the company he had once built on greed. But now, with the chance to lead again, this time with integrity, he knew what he had to do. "Emily, are you sure?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly with emotion. "I don't deserve this second chance, not after everything." "I know," she replied quietly, "but you've proven that you're willing to change, and that's all we can ask for." Charles took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. This was the moment he had feared, a moment when he would have to prove to the world that he had truly changed. He wasn't just rebuilding a company, he was rebuilding his life, his relationships, and his very sense of self-worth. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said with determination. But this time, it is not about power or wealth. It is about rebuilding the trust that was broken, and making sure we never lose sight of what truly matters. "Good," Emily said with a smile in her voice. "We'll be waiting for you." The following weeks were a blur of meetings, strategy sessions, and difficult decisions. Charles returned to the company, not as the domineering CEO he once was, but as a leader focused on honesty, compassion, and accountability. He made sure to involve everyone in the decision-making process, consulting employees at every level of the company, and listening to their concerns. But the true test came when he was faced with a major financial setback. A competitor, once part of the same industry, had launched an aggressive marketing campaign that threatened to push his company out of the market. For a moment, Charles felt the old urges rise up, the desire to fight back, to take risks, to do whatever it took to win. But he knew better now. He understood that true success wasn't about defeating the competition, it was about rising above it. In a tense board meeting, Charles addressed the situation calmly, outlining a new strategy that focused on providing value to their customers, rather than just beating the competition. It wasn't a flashy plan, but it was sustainable. It was ethical. And most importantly, it aligned with the company's newly revamped mission. "I know this one to be easy," Charles said, his voice steady, "but I believe this is the only way we can move forward without compromising our values. We don't need to defeat anyone, we just need to be the best version of ourselves. The board members, who had once been skeptical, now nodded in agreement. Emily, sitting across from him, gave him a look of quiet pride. It wasn't the old Charles. This was a different man, one who had learned from his mistakes, who had chosen to lead with humility and a sense of responsibility. The months that followed were a testament to Charles' growth. The company slowly regained its footing, and more importantly, Charles' personal life began to stabilize. His relationship with Olivia, though still fragile, was stronger than it had been in years. They learned to communicate again, to understand each other's needs, and to rebuild the trust that had been shattered by his actions. Charles made time for the things that truly mattered now: his family, his friends, and the people who had stood by him through it all. He didn't need to prove anything to the world anymore. He had proven it to himself. And then, one morning, as Charles was walking through the park near his home, a familiar face caught his eye. It was the young girl, the one he had once watched as part of his cruel test. She was standing at the edge of the park, a flower in her hand. As their eyes met, a smile tugged at the corners of her lips. Charles approached her slowly, his heart heavy with emotion. "You've come a long way," the girl said softly, her voice gentle, almost like an echo of his past. "I have," Charles replied, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'll never forget what you taught me. You showed me the power of kindness, of integrity, things I thought I'd lost forever." The girl nodded, her eyes shining. "I knew you'd get there, Charles. You just needed to find your way." Charles smiled, and for the first time in his life he felt truly free. He had learned that the road to redemption wasn't just about making up for past mistakes. It was about creating a future where those mistakes no longer defined him. He had found his way, and with that, Charles walked forward into his new life, not as the man he had once been, but as the man he had always had the potential to be. A man who had learned the hard way, but had emerged stronger, kinder, and wiser. The future was still uncertain, but it was filled with hope. And that was all he needed.